An alumnus of the Obama administration, filling two positions as Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and later the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Shaun has reached the highest levels of government. Before serving in the Obama administration, Shaun was the Housing Commissioner here in New York City. I'm sure you will hear more about how Shaun became so interested in public service as I ask him questions about his positions on the issues. But I will mention that Shaun volunteered in a homeless shelter while in college and became a community organizer in Brooklyn shortly thereafter obtained a master's degree in public administration. Tonight, we get to hear how Shaun's life of public service informs his perspectives on the issues. I am looking forward to a lively discussion. And with that brief overview, it is my pleasure now to introduce Democratic mayoral candidate, Shaun Donovan. Welcome, Shaun.
Michael, it's so great to be joining you by the fire for this chat. Thank you.
I was trying to create a certain ambiance.
You did it.
Oh, great. Well, anyway, welcome. I'm glad you're able to make it tonight. I know you have a very busy schedule, but there are issues that are of real importance to New Yorkers. And what I've found over the years, and especially in recent years, is that during the question and answer sessions with members of the media and with other forums, because there are so many candidates talking about so many different issues, it's very difficult to really dig into the meaty points that people care about most in New York. And so with that in mind, I'm going to try to get into some of the more detailed issues of policy with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing how you feel about the issues. With that in mind, I'd like to first talk about housing and homeless policy. On February 4th, you unveiled an ambitious housing plan designed to eradicate homelessness here in New York. Today, we have tens of thousands of homeless individuals living on the streets and in the shelter system. Everyone agrees that there's a problem and a tragedy, but no one has yet offered a workable solution. Shaun, your proposal includes creating 30,000 affordable housing units per year to be funded by federal and state governments. My first question for you is, given the fiscal crises afflicting both state and federal government, how can you be assured that you'll have the funding you need to fulfill the ambitious aspirations of your plan?
So, Michael, thank you for starting with this. And this is how my public service started for me. I grew up in New York City in the 70s and 80s. I watched homelessness exploding on our streets. And I asked myself, how can it be in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country on earth, we allow our neighbors to sleep on our streets? And so you're right. You mentioned earlier, I started volunteering in a homeless shelter. I actually went to work for the National Coalition for the Homeless before coming back to New York. And this has been an animating reason for my public service for the last 3 decades. And I want to say the reason why folks on tonight should trust that I actually have a plan that can dramatically reduce homelessness in this city is because that's what I did as housing secretary for President Obama. I led the strategy that cut street and family homelessness by 25% and ended veteran homelessness in more than 80 cities and states. Not reduced it, but ended it. Here's what we learned, Michael, and this goes to your question about how we can afford it. I would say if you believe we can't afford it, I would say we can't afford not to end homelessness, because we are now spending $3 billion a year on shelters and on hotels and getting bad results. We could not only end the scourge of homelessness in the city, we could actually save money by moving to what we did under the Obama administration, which is a housing first strategy. How could that be, you ask? Because where do folks that live in shelters or on our streets get their health care? They get it in our emergency rooms. They cycle in and out of Rikers and the mental health wings of our hospitals. Today, New York City spends more than $400,000 per prisoner per year at Rikers, and we get bad results. So actually, we are not only wasting lives, we are wasting money with our shelter first strategy. If we reimagine the right to shelter as a right to housing, we could both save lives and save money as well.
Well, I understand where you're coming from on that, but your plan does focus on state and federal funding. And right now, from a fiscal perspective, our federal government it's like burning money, right? We just passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus, which is necessary, I'm sure, but it's more money going out. How are we going to be able to get the funding from the Biden administration in order to make your plan happen?
So specifically, and I've actually been working with not only the Biden administration, but also members of Congress on this. We just passed $25 billion of rental assistance. It was modeled on the rental assistance we created in the wake of the Great Recession. The $1.9 trillion stimulus includes another $30 billion in rental assistance. So the tools that we need, most importantly, on moving people quickly from the streets and shelter into housing, are already part of the bill and can be a huge piece of help. So that's first. Second, I would go back to the state and negotiate a similar agreement that I negotiated when I was housing commissioner in this city, called New York 3, to get investments in services. We proved then that those can be paid for by savings in the kind of institutional settings. So I don't think even in a budget deficit situation, I think there's an even greater reason for the state to be investing in the services and supportive housing. And then lastly, what I proposed is that we would redirect city resources as well to get to $500 million in our rental assistance program that would come out of reinvesting the money we're currently spending on hotels and on shelters.
While you were in the cabinet, did you forge any relationships with people on Capitol Hill or with members of the now Biden administration that might assist you in generating some sort of pipeline where we can get some money to the city?
Absolutely, Michael. Look, I not only have deep working relationships with the president himself and the vice president, who was AG in California when I was HUD secretary, worked very closely on the mortgage crisis. Nearly every senior official in the Biden administration is not just a colleague, but a friend, including the head of the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, the Treasury Secretary, and so many others. But here's the other thing. I did work incredibly closely with leaders on Capitol Hill. In December, when the most recent COVID relief package was under debate, I was actually on the phone with 3 out of the gang of 8 senators that were negotiating it on both sides of the aisle, giving them advice about how to structure the unemployment insurance, the housing aid, the transit aid, all of the things that really are making a difference in New York City already.
So you mentioned something about hotels and not getting a great return on investment. One hotel that's been used as a transit facility has been the Lucerne on the Upper West Side, which is a hot political issue over there, and it's become a legal issue as well. To what extent do you think that the use of the hotels, or at least that particular one, the programs that were used there, could serve as a model or not for the city? Because it sounded to me in your answer that you weren't all that high on using hotels.
Well, first of all, Michael, you're being modest here. This has become a legal victory because of your hard work. So thank you for your leadership on it. And I will say I was proud to join you as an expert witness on the case because of my long history of working on these issues. What I think is so really moving about what you and Goddard Riverside and Upper West Side Open Hearts Initiative have done is you have started to move from a shelter model at that hotel to exactly the model that I'm talking about, that is supportive housing. And what I mean by that is you've helped Shams DeBaron, all the other residents there, not just have a place to lay their head, but a place to actually get job training and jobs, to get the mental health and other supports that they need on site. That's the critical piece that turns shelter into housing, specifically supportive housing, and that's what solves this problem.
So the housing crisis should, I'm sorry, but there should be an adjunct to the housing part of your plan that will include on-site mental health programs, job training programs, so that we can transition people from the shelter system to permanent housing. That's part of what you're trying to develop.
That is called supportive housing. We invented it in New York. It has transformed the ability to end homelessness. And that is what we need to be investing in. Because that is what breaks the cycle. And I want to say, Michael, it's not just moving folks from shelter. We should be developing a system called coordinated entry, where anytime someone is leaving Rikers, the mental health wing of one of our hospitals, we have a coordinated system across the whole city government that places people directly into that kind of housing. Because what happens now is they fall through the cracks. And as we've seen with Shams and the other men at the Lucerne, it takes months, if not years, to move them into that housing. The best cities across the country, we worked with them to develop these coordinated entry systems so that you move directly from those institutional settings into housing and don't end up on the streets or in shelter in the first place.
So just so for people who know, because I didn't want to sound like too much inside baseball, Shams DeBaron is one of the leaders of the homeless coalition of the individuals who live at the Lucerne. He has been a powerful advocate in support of the rights of homeless persons in New York. The last issue on housing and homelessness before we turn to the next issue, I want to talk about a hot issue that a number of people have contacted me about, and that's this. In the city, over the last 6.5, 7 years, there has been a critical feature of the housing, I should say critical, essential feature of the de Blasio housing program is to incentivize private developers by giving them bonuses, FAR, and things of that nature to create housing or affordable housing for people. To what extent do you think this has been successful? And do you think we're giving up too much to developers in order to incentivize them, whereas maybe we should, instead of subcontracting this to private development, should we be doing these things on our own?
So, Michael, it's such an important question. And I want to begin, you mentioned that I'd studied public administration. I also studied architecture. And I'm married to a landscape architect. I believe, as you well know, I believe fundamentally that design and the character of our neighborhoods is critical to what makes New York City, New York City. And I live in a landmark neighborhood in Boerum Hill in Brooklyn, raised my kids there. And one of the reasons we moved there is because we loved the sense of sky and space, the conversations we had on our stoops with our neighbors. And so as mayor, I would ensure that we're creating true planning in this city, neighborhood-based, community-based planning, so that we're preserving the character of our neighborhoods. Having said that, I do think there are places where we do need to create more affordable housing. We do need to grow. We need to do that carefully and in partnership with neighborhoods. And we should never have a situation where a bonus in inclusionary zoning allows you to create a building that destroys character in a neighborhood. So I think that's a critical piece of what that planning would do. I also think that, having said that, inclusionary zoning can be an important piece of the strategy, and here's why. We've learned over decades of housing policy that creating mixed income housing rather than concentrating all of our low income housing in marginal neighborhoods, communities of color, can really destroy the opportunities for all New Yorkers to move ahead. So I do think mixing affordable housing in through inclusionary zoning is an important thing. I would lastly say, I started my career working for a nonprofit when I came back from graduate school in the Bronx, in central Brooklyn. I think we ought to be doing much more with our nonprofit developers that really have community and affordability at heart. I think for-profit developers can be a part of the solution, but I think we can be doing much more to have a broader range of folks involved in our affordable housing, and that is a critical piece as well.
I appreciate that answer, but it has led to several questions which I had listed in advance, but they're pouring in both in my text on my phone as well on the chat. So I'm going to get right to the meat question here, and that's this. There is a serious concern about the relationship right now between the de Blasio administration and something called the Real Estate Board of New York. The acronym for that is REBNY. There's a concern that there's too close a connection. So the question that I've been asked is, will the dog stop barking? The question is, will you agree not to accept money from REBNY and real estate developers in connection with your campaign?
So I am absolutely not accepting money from REBNY's PAC or anything like that. I am taking money from real estate developers and nonprofits and others. I want to say again, I have worked all my career starting 30 years ago with small immigrant owners of buildings. And I think we have to understand that this is not a one-size-fits-all real estate industry in New York. We have to understand that nonprofits and many others, as I said a moment ago, can and should play a big role. But what I am doing on every single contribution is looking at those who those contributions come from. I'm screening out any single contribution that comes from anyone who's on the bad landlord list in the city or has real problems in the work that they've done in the city. We do that on every single donation.
Mm. Okay, but I can tell you that there will be a concern that the relationship between City Hall and big real estate, especially given the recent history, is something that's going to concern some people. How can you assuage their concerns that the funding that you're going to get from real estate developers isn't going to in some way inform your policies as a mayor?
I would say, Michael, I have the longest and deepest track record of anybody in this race of having worked my entire career to ensure that housing is a right, that it is affordable. And I have taken on developers time and time again to make sure that we're ending homelessness, creating more affordable housing, planning communities that actually work for residents. And so all of those are things that you don't have to take my word for. Look at my record again and again on these issues.
Okay, let's change gears to the privatization of public assets. About 7 years ago, then public advocate Bill de Blasio urged New Yorkers to support him because he claimed that he would prevent the privatization of public assets, which had become a central feature of the Bloomberg administration plans for the city. A prime example of this is the New York Public Library, where at the time there was he was advocating in support of ending the central library plan, but then shortly after he became mayor, he reversed his position. And since he's been mayor, the number of hours at the library went from 80 hours a week to 56 hours a week, and that was before COVID. Saturday hours were eliminated, Sunday hours and weekday hours have been drastically drawn back, and we have learned that part of the reason for this may be to assure the New York Public Library's availability for private events like weddings and corporate events. To that end, with the support of the de Blasio administration, an application before the Landmarks Preservation Commission was approved to create catering elevators and loading bays to facilitate food service at the New York Public Library at the expense of reading rooms and other areas of public concern. Do you support the reduction of public hours, and what would you as mayor do about the use of our public facilities for private events?
So, Michael, not only do I not support the reduction of hours, when I announced my run for mayor this past December, one of the very first policies I announced in that very speech was that as mayor, I would open every one of our libraries 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I fundamentally understand that libraries are a critical piece of our social infrastructure. To borrow a term from a great book, if you haven't read it, Palaces for the People, a terrific NYU professor who writes about libraries as the center of our public infrastructure. We should ensure that libraries are open every single hour of every single day, and that we're funding them so that you don't need to rely on catering or any of those services. And look, what better reminder have we had than the incredibly tragic past year that we've had with COVID, where we've seen the disproportionate access to technology, to broadband, has devastated communities that haven't been connected. Libraries are one of the powerful hubs in our neighborhoods that have kept people connected. And so we have to make sure that we're opening them 24/7 across the city.
And what about their use as for private events like weddings and corporate events? Do you support?
Michael, the only reason they're doing it is because they don't have the funding to support them. If you're actually funding the ability to keep them open 24/7, then you wouldn't need to move in that direction. You wouldn't need private events to support them. And so we have to be ensuring that we're funding all of our libraries to stay open at an
Your
adequate.
sense, so your sense is that by providing additional funding, it won't be necessary to use private events as a means of adding to their
Yeah,
revenue.
I'm happy to have a policy that says you can't do it, but I think the fundamental challenge is that we haven't been funding them adequately.
Okay. But you are committed to a 24/7 libraries being available, particularly among others, the main branch of the New York Public Library, the Brooklyn Library. These are libraries that should remain open all the time.
Absolutely. My
Wonderful.
mother-in-law lives across the street from the main branch in Brooklyn and misses it desperately.
The next question I have to do, the next subject matter is politicization of city agencies. Studies have shown that applications before the Board of Standards and Appeals for zoning variances, and by that I mean applications to deviate from what's permitted under zoning, are granted to developers at a rate of over 97%, which means almost all the time. A developer goes to the BSA and they want to get a special exception just for them, they get one. Many critics have argued that the reason for this grant rate is the composition of the Board of Standards and Appeals, which is chaired by a former real estate lobbyist. My question for you is, what would the selection process for appointments to city agencies like the Board of Standards and Appeals look like under a Donovan administration?
Yeah, Michael, this is such an important question, and you've asked it about BSA. We have a much broader problem around this on our community boards in so many different areas across city government, and it has to move from a process that is essentially granting favors, those who have been contributors, those who have been engaged in some way politically, to picking people based on expertise and who they represent. And I think one of the things, if you look at my record as a leader, whether it was developing the most beautiful affordable housing in the South Bronx, it's on Brook Avenue, it's called Via Verde. I did that through a worldwide design competition where I brought architects, partnered them with local community organizations. On Sandy, I did the same thing. I always brought to the table folks that truly represented their communities to drive the planning. The same thing has to be done inside government itself, where we need to ensure that we are ending the practice of pay to play in terms of making appointments. And I am absolutely committed to putting in place standards, as we did in the Obama administration, of ensuring both on coming into government that we're not bringing lobbyists or any conflicts of interest, and upon exit that we have much longer standards for when you can go back into jobs that are related to public functions. I signed those agreements and I still live by them even years after leaving the cabinet.
And I'm going to get to that because that's actually my next question. But before we get to it, I want to really dig down a little bit deeper, though. I'm sure that if Bill de Blasio were on this call and I asked him the question, he would say something similar to what you said. He would say, I'm going after the best experts, the people most qualified for the positions, irrespective of politics. But how would you ensure it? In other words, what criteria are you going to look at? Are you going to consider forming panels that would select these individuals? Would you draw on your own personal relationships? Would you talk to other public officials? Like, what would it look like?
So, Michael, first of all, you're right that a politician can come on this or any other place and say whatever they want, right? Judge me by my deeds, not just my words. And if you look at my record, a very, very long record in public service, I have never had an issue around pay to play. I've never had an issue around being accused of favoring a real estate interest. I have always played it straight, and that's my number one point that I would make here. Second, as I said earlier, I am absolutely committed to creating standards around pay to play, both coming in and going out. Third, I think you're absolutely right that we do need clear and transparent standards that would be publishable around how are you selecting, and to be able to be held accountable around those standards for how we're selecting people for important positions.
Well, that's good to know because I think having standards, discernible, objective standards that people can look at, that where there's a level of transparency, is critical because so much of the criticism that's been leveled against the de Blasio administration is precisely because don't appear to be any standards and there's almost no transparency on the selection process. So I'm glad to hear you talk about that. And now turning to the question that you anticipated, which was about how long after your service can you, as a member of a commission or a board or an agency, turn to the private sector. So I'll give you the lead in for that. The last chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission left her position to become a lobbyist at one of New York City's most successful and ambitious real estate lobbying firms. Owing to the compensation disparity between public and private employment, one can only imagine the institutional incentives that may exist to entice commissioners and board members to provide favorable treatment to those who ultimately seek approvals for their projects. I'm not suggesting that happened here, but what I am suggesting to you is that it does present an issue. How long should commissioners, and especially chairs, wait before moving on from public service to the private sector where they would be advocating in support of positions and in front of the very boards that they headed up or served on before they went into the private sector?
Yeah. So, Michael, again, this is something that if you look at what we did in the Obama administration, we created both on coming into government and on leaving government much stricter standards than any prior administration. To be clear, there is a whole set of issues that you should have a lifetime ban on representing government on. So to be clear, anything that you worked on personally and substantially as a government employer, you should never be able to present or discuss with government. That's the standard I signed when I entered the Obama cabinet. And that is the standard we ought to have in New York. For other matters that are related more generally to the...
I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to drill down just a little bit. Is it, when you say a lifetime ban about specific matters, are you talking about projects or are you talking about boards? In other words, can a chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission later become a lobbyist before the Landmarks Preservation Commission? Or is that a lifetime ban, or is it like a year, 2 years, 3 years? What do you think?
I think it ought to be, the standard we had in the Obama administration was 5 years. I think it's a good standard. So on issues that aren't a lifetime ban, I think we do need a longer standard in terms of any interaction with government on those issues.
I think a 5 years, the distance of 5 years would be really a citywide change that would be catalytic. It would be a wonderful thing. So I thank you for that answer. I interrupted you in the middle of your answer, but I just wanted to get to that. So if you want to finish.
You're a good lawyer. You're a good lawyer and a good friend.
I appreciate that. And by the way, if you saw me reaching down, it's because I was about to throw another log on the fire, but I positioned my chair too far from the fireplace. And frankly, I'm afraid I'm going to kill the dog if I throw the wood. The fire is just going to have to die behind me.
I thought you were reaching down to pet the dog, actually. So.
No, it was a piece of wood. One example that has been used to describe the leanings of the de Blasio administration is the development at 200 Amsterdam Avenue on the Upper West Side, which is a very significant issue. The courts initially rejected the Board of Standards and Appeals approval of the plan for the mega tower at that location. The matter was remanded back to the BSA. The Board of Standards and Appeals then approved it again, and the court rejected it a second time, but then the appeals court actually reinstated what the BSA had done. What can be done?
Just a few days ago.
Yeah, just earlier this week. What can be done to prevent the city from becoming just an assortment of high-rise, mega tall buildings that are catering to the super rich?
Well, fixing the BSA would be part of it, absolutely. And look, we've already talked, Michael, about the kinds of transparency, the kinds of standards that we need to have. We also, frankly, need to have a much earlier and more comprehensive way that the Department of City Planning interacts with communities. I like to say we've essentially moved to a place where we have a Department of City Zoning, not a Department of City Planning. To me, real planning begins with engaging with communities much earlier, well before rezoning ever happens, to discuss what should be height limits. Where should, if there's going to be new development, where should it take place? In what places on the avenues rather than the mid blocks? What should the character of the buildings look like? So part of the problem here is the specifics of the lack of transparency, all the issues we've talked about. Part of it is that we have a planning process that has left behind communities again and again. And that's what I have tried to change in my leadership, in the work that I've done, whether as housing commissioner or as HUD secretary, that I think would fundamentally change our approach. And I have many, many proposals. My website is shaunfornyc.com. I like to say we're running the campaign of ideas. I have a very detailed set of proposals around how to change our planning process in the city to avoid issues like this in the future.
Okay. Before I turn to the next issue, I just wanted to drill down on one other point. You mentioned the BSA and reforms. At the first forum, Ben Kalos talked about his activities on the city council. He ushered in a plan which was approved that imposed a requirement that all applicants before the BSA be sworn in, and that any material false statements result in a fine. I think it was $15,000. I asked Ben whether he would support, and I will ask you the same question. Would you support a proposal that does more than that? Because the truth is, a $15,000 or $20,000 fine for a $300 million building, it's like a parking ticket to developers. Would you support legislation that required that any application before the BSA that is supported by a material misrepresentation by the applicant be rejected? In other words, not just a fine, but actually the application, if they file an application with the BSA that contains a material false statement, would you say that application has to be rejected? If they want to file a new one, they can try, but the process has to start all over again.
So that sounds fair to me. You're the lawyer, not me. It sounds to me like the definition of material would be really important in that law. So yes, I just want to make sure that the definition of material is the right definition.
Well, if you become mayor, I'll be glad to draft the language.
Okay.
Let's turn to preservation. Preservationists are up in arms over a series of projects around the city right now, which they claim pose a threat to our city's landmarks. The McGraw-Hill lobby is currently threatened with demolition or partial demolition. The Merchants House Museum, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is similarly threatened with an adjacent development. And today, a 1,600-foot high tower is planned and was recently approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission to replace the Grand Hyatt, directly adjacent to and partially connected with the iconic Grand Central Terminal. How would a Donovan administration protect our New York City landmarks?
So, Michael, first of all, I want to say Grand Central Terminal is my favorite building in the world. And
it's magnificent, right?
I will often just walk through, look up at the stars in that ceiling. It is absolutely magnificent. And I will say, as a student, as somebody who studied architecture, just the photographs of Penn Station make you cry to know that that is now scattered around the Meadowlands, that incredible McKim and White building. So, and Farley is great. I worked for Senator Moynihan as an intern, and I'm so glad to see his name in the new waiting room at Farley, but it is a shadow of the original Penn Station. And so, look, I am deeply committed to, as I said a moment ago, creating a planning process and going farther than that, creating real standards around height, around character that are enforceable, and ensuring that we are preserving in real substantial ways the things that make our neighborhoods special in New York. Because my view, I've spent a lot of time as HUD secretary traveling to other cities and other countries, meeting with mayors. Our cities are looking more and more the same around the world. And unless New York remains a place that is different, that is unique, that maintains its character of neighborhoods, we're never going to come back, much less be the city that we should be again. So I know that's a very broad statement, but it is very, very central to who I am and all the work that I've done over my lifetime. I also think it goes back to many of the things that we said of who are you appointing? What are the standards that you are putting in place for preservation? And are you making both transparent and explicit the ways in which you're making judgments about landmarks, so that all New Yorkers can have faith that this is not being dominated by real estate interests, but by the important preservation of the character of our communities.
Well, in addition to the character of the community, I would also mention very briefly about how important what the important role that landmarks play in the education and the enrichment of people of the city. When you look at a building like, for example, the Merchant's House, which was constructed in 1832, and is one of the most enriching landmarks that I've ever walked through. It is a tableau of 19th century New York City, everything fully and completely preserved. But right now, there is an adjacent development that is under consideration by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And there is a concern. Several engineers and architects have come forward and said that if the adjacent development goes forward, the Merchant's House Museum could be damaged, if not destroyed. So would you as mayor commit to halting projects that are adjacent, like, for example, same thing with the Hyatt next to the Grand Central Terminal? Would you as a mayor call for there to be a halt to all projects that are directly adjacent to landmarks to ensure that our landmarks are protected? Will you make sure that the landmarks law protects not only the construction on the landmarks, I guess, but also on properties directly adjacent to landmarks to make sure that the landmark properties are protected?
So Mike, I want to make sure I understand the question, because it doesn't sound to me right that you could never create a project next to a landmark. In fact, you wouldn't want to keep a hole in the ground next to a landmark. The question is, what are the standards, I believe, that should apply to any project that goes up, and whether it is.
Let me clarify if I can.
That landmark, right?
Let me just clarify for just a second. Obviously, we don't want to stop all development in the city if there happens to be a landmark nearby. But when I say halt, I'm not talking about a halt forever, just a stop, if you will, to make sure that whatever adjacent construction is going forward, that landmark preservationists, people who really have an understanding of landmark properties, are called in as experts to make sure about our preservation of landmarks. Because right now, under the landmarks law, if you have a landmark, let's say at property A, and property B is under development, the Landmarks Preservation Commission may very well take the position that it has no jurisdiction whatsoever to have any influence over that project. And worse, the owner of the landmark, or the city of New York, would have no ability to modify or call for restrictions on that development to prevent damage to precious landmarks.
Look, I think it's absolutely right. There need to be standards around construction, make sure there's no harm. But I would go further than that. I think this is the right way to think about this, is where you have the most important landmarks, or you have a collection of really important buildings that you look at landmark districts, not just at individual landmark buildings, right? I live in a landmark district where every building within a certain geography is covered. Not every one of them is covered to the same standards. It may be facades versus, right? But I do think this is an example where on Merchant's House, I would think aggressively about, can you create a district that would ensure that within a certain distance of such an important landmark. Grand Central Terminal is a similar thing. We should never have anything that imposes on that. And it's interesting, in a very different context, the High Line, there was zoning created around the High Line that preserved views, light, and many others. We should be looking at those types of things for landmarks as well, so that you create a zoning envelope around it that preserves its character.
Before we go to the speed round, which I'll cover in a moment, that'll be fun.
Fasten my seatbelt.
So let me just talk to you briefly about one other issue, and that is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is currently occupying space in Central Park, and it gets rent-free. Under statute, New Yorkers are allowed to enter the museum for free. Over the years, that free admission has sort of been modified a bit, and people can pay what they want. But during COVID, the only way you can buy a ticket to the museum is you have to go through a kiosk, which requires you to pay, I think it's $25 a person to enter the museum, and then you get to go in on a limited basis with other people. So in other words, it's no longer, not only it's not free, it's not pay what you want, you have to pay the max, or I should say a threshold minimum. How would you address issues like that where there are places in the city where through a public-private partnership, New Yorkers are supposed to get free admission or low price admission and just not able to get in because, for example, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art with a family of 4, maybe $75. It's not inexpensive for a lot of families.
Yeah, look, this is a place where there are kind of 3 levels that a mayor can pursue something like this. One is obviously the bully pulpit, and the bully pulpit is a powerful pulpit when you're mayor of New York. Second, many of those institutions are receiving direct city funding, and there's absolutely ways to condition policies around access, particularly for people with disabilities, low income, et cetera. And you can create standards around that. Third is nonprofit institutions benefit from not paying property tax in many cases, or other benefits from the city that can also be part of a discussion that would ensure that public benefits, art, culture, truly are public. And so I'm certainly be prepared, as I have been in my public career, to use all 3 of those levers to make sure that we're ensuring truly public benefits are public.
So would you as mayor take a close look at some of those public-private institutions like, for example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, to make sure that they are accessible not just to the people who can afford to pay those minimum prices, but to everyone, since after all, people are paying for admission to those museums by virtue of their taxes, for example, because the city is subsidizing all of them.
Yeah, look, I am not right here going to get into the details of whether every single person should be absolutely 100% required to be able to walk into the Metropolitan Museum and never have to pay anything. I'm not sure. Right. I'm not sure that in terms of public resources, I have always felt that we ought to have a progressive system where the lower the income, the easier access we have. And so you have to think carefully about how you're spending public, but absolutely the example that you're talking about, where we've created a standard at a time where we're all locked in our Zoom boxes going crazy and could desperately use some art, to create an exclusive policy like that feels to me like something that certainly as mayor, I'd be willing to take a stand on.
Great. All right, get ready for the speed round. Buckle up. And some people have said these are the hardest questions I ask. I don't know. We'll see. Ready? Knicks or Nets?
Knicks.
Okay.
Even though I live in Brooklyn, I'm sorry.
Listen, I live in Brooklyn also, and I am also a Knicks fan. If there were one person whose leadership style you'd like to adopt as your own or to model after, whose would it be?
John Lewis. I met John Lewis 30 years ago this year when I was a student and retraced the route of the Freedom Rides on the 30th anniversary. And it started a 30-year-long friendship with him before he passed away this past summer.
Very nice. Beatles or Rolling Stones?
Beatles.
Favorite
hard one, though.
What's that?
It's a hard one.
It is. Favorite movie comedy?
Ooh. Blazing Saddles.
Okay, good choice.
Just thinking about it makes you laugh, right?
Absolutely. It's a ridiculous movie. Your favorite season?
Spring.
Water skiing, downhill skiing, cross-country skiing?
Yes.
Favorite family activity at home?
Lego.
Lego. Okay.
You remember those days, right?
I
When
do.
our boys were hours and hours.
On the floor, yep. If you had to give up ice cream or pizza, which would it be?
Neither.
You have to pick one, Shaun. All right, I'll let you off the hook on the pizza question. Here's an interesting one. Which recording artist from your iPhone or wherever you keep your music would we be most surprised to find out is on your list? In other words, which recording artist is the most unusual for you? And no, you can't use your son Lucas's band on the answer to this question.
Ooh, now I'm gonna have to think about it. Kamasi, Washington.
Okay, interesting. And lastly, and this one is a little bit more serious. New York State is currently considering legalizing adult use, or some people say recreational cannabis. Do you support the idea? And if so, would you insist that such a program include racial and social equity provisions?
So yes, on both. And in fact, my transportation plan commits, we believe that there's $500 to $750 million in revenue that could come. We ought to dedicate a significant portion of that to expanding transportation options in a way that expands equity in New York City as well.
And maybe some of the sales tax revenue could help support some other plans the city might be interested in developing over time. Anyway, those are my questions. Thank you very much, Shaun. I want to turn to our public part of the Q&A process. We've been inundated with questions. I'm going to turn to our producer, Liz Blaze, who is helping us all the way from the state of Oregon, and see if maybe, I don't know if we're going to do it by video or we're going to do it by the chat. So Liz, if you would let us know how this is going to work. It's been an interesting thing each time, and I'm getting a note from her now. Going live. Here we go. I should have had some more filler time. The first question looks like to be coming from from Howard Shane. And I can't unmute you, Howard, nor can I undo your video, but I bet you that Liz Blaze can do that. Liz, whenever you're ready.
I am trying, Howard. I'm trying to unmute you if you can talk. Otherwise, I can read your question for you.
It looks like he's been unmuted. Howard, are you there? Howard, you're either muted or you're speaking very quietly. All right, I think.
Or he's eating pizza and ice cream.
All right, I'm going to read his question out loud for you guys. With regard to preserving the character of neighborhoods, can it ever be possible that neighborhood residents, and neighborhoods will have to be defined, can vote to accept or reject specific new buildings proposed before the city grants building permits? This voting can be achieved by computer access and could result in prevention of super tall, characterless buildings in neighborhoods proud of their charm and small town nature. To add to my question, most New Yorkers now feel that the community has no say in development, that protests are largely ignored, and real estate developers have their way with the administration. Thank you, Howard.
So Howard, I do believe there is a way that we could achieve what you're talking about in terms of voting. I also think, and I want to go back to what I said earlier to be a little more specific. In my career, and I'll give you a very good example, after Sandy, we created a process called Rebuild by Design that brought community members, community organizations to the table at the very beginning, side by side with architects, to plan for those communities. And we should be doing the same thing in our planning in the city. Rather than coming to neighbors and communities once a proposal from the Department of City Planning is done, we should have you engaged early on. One of the things that's remarkable, back from when I went to architecture school, and there was no such thing as AutoCAD, you can now use incredibly advanced three-dimensional modeling and other ways to help communities who are not experts on, as architects, really see what buildings will look like, see what alternative plans could look like. And so the power of these innovations could allow not just voting, but real interactive design sessions with communities that would allow a much more democratic process to shape what our communities look like in New York. So I think it goes beyond just voting. It goes to a much deeper and earlier process of community engaged planning that ensures not just that you don't get buildings you don't want, but that you get buildings you want and you get a neighborhood that you want with the kind of amenities that you want.
Just to follow up on that question, one proposal that I have heard is the idea of having a floating seat on the BSA, the Board of Standards and Appeals, and the City Planning Commission for representatives of the neighborhoods in which the projects would be developed. So for example, if there's a development in Brooklyn Heights, for example, someone from, I think it's Community Board 6, someone from Community Board 6 would be able to sit on the BSA and add, or it have to be 2 votes to make it an odd number, to add those people onto the BSA for that project. So they wouldn't be able to control the outcome, but they would have a greater influence in its outcome by virtue of their participation as board members. What do you think about that idea?
I like it. Send me the proposal. I want to see it.
Okay, I'll reach out. Because that gives real participation for the communities on those particular boards. Doesn't have them completely control the boards, but it obviously expands the influence significantly.
I also think, my experience has been that you don't necessarily have true community representation on the community boards all the time. And I think there are things you could do in terms of paying community board members and other things that would allow people to have the time and ability to dedicate to making the community boards truly representative too.
That's a great idea. There's a cannabis question. I think it's similar to the question I asked earlier, but I want to make sure I recognize it. It's by Ron Shapira. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Your views on how to best leverage adult use cannabis to generate jobs, tax revenues, including social justice measures that are tangible and accessible. So that's similar to the question I asked you earlier, but maybe you could provide some detail that Mr. Shapiro would be interested in.
So the question was about jobs. Clearly, you'll have jobs generated in the sale and other sort of supply chain pieces there. I do think that, although I'm not an expert on this, I would be interested to see whether there's a potential for farming as well. One of my favorite projects I talked about earlier, Via Verde, actually has rooftop vegetable gardens, fruit trees that create food that children can pick in the evening and then eat for dinner at night.
Shaun, if you are proposing a rooftop cannabis grow operation in the city of New York, I think you just won the election.
I think it is certain. We grow a lot of other things on our rooftops. We ought to grow more of them and create more green roofs. It's very good for climate. So I think it's certainly a possibility. But in terms of the other jobs, which I think are going to be more prevalent in New York, I think this really goes to a lot of my job training and other things that I'm proposing. We need to create a much better connection between our schools and jobs. And that means creating the New York City Job Corps, the largest internship and training program, I think, that New York City has ever seen. And I think this could be an aspect of that, where we're preparing people for growing industries and training so that we get real representation, people of color who are able to benefit from these jobs as a restorative measure from the long-time disproportionate impact on communities of color.
Wonderful. I think that's actually a very nice place to stop. We're actually at the 1 hour mark. Shaun, thank you so much.
Time flies when we're having fun.
It's good. Listen,
and you got to restoke your fire as well.
I know, without killing the dog as I do it. I do want to thank you very much for this conversation. We know each other, but we very rarely talk politics. And it's nice to have a sit down with someone who's really prepared to talk about the issues in an in-depth way. As far as the next steps go, I'm going to be conducting a forum, not next week. Next week I'm taking off, but the following week on March 18th. Liz, who would we have on March 18th?
March 18th, we are hosting Brad Hoylman.
Brad Hoylman, who is running for Manhattan Borough President. So I look forward to an in-depth conversation with him as well. Again, Shaun, thank you very much for coming. And for those of you who are sending in questions, thank you so much for your engagement. I would say to all of you watching out there, this is the opportunity for you to engage, not only on this forum, but on others. It is critical, I think. If you want to have an influence in your government, you have to participate in forums like this. You have to come out and you have to vote, because ultimately, I would say what some very astute politicians said years and years ago: you get the government you deserve. So if you want to deserve a better government, you got to work hard to get your better government. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Shaun, and I look forward to hearing more about you on the campaign trail. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Michael. Big elbow bump to all of you.